thanks everyone for coming to our first CAG Talk. As a professor, I wake up most days really animated by the question, what if? Right? I'm constantly sort of asking this question. And so in my role as scholar in residence, I decided to ask the big question, right? What if our fundamentals about how we operate in this space are actually not right? And that wouldn't be surprising, right? Because we're just really still at the formative stage of trying to figure out what is cyberspace and how do we act in this arena. And so I'm going to jump to the punchline. We're not aligned to that reality. And so this talk is going to introduce you to a little different set of thinking, right? My goal is to get us to a point where we can actually think through in a deeper sense an operational art of cyber. But we can't get there unless we make sure that these assumptions map to the reality of the strategic environment that we're in. Cyberspace is a complex environment. We tend to think about it as this threat environment. A threat environment of multiple actors, right? Whether it's nation states, non-state actors, hacktivists, business community, citizens, private sector firms driven by profit. All of these different actors are driving a formative set of dynamics, operating in this space, seeking their own interests. The norms of this space are being driven by their behavior. At the end of World War II, the United States was positioned globally to set the rules of the road and establish the institutions to support those roles. We could do so because we had a near monopoly on the distribution of benefits and the imposition of costs, right? If you wanted the benefits of Bretton Woods, you had to align with the U.S. approach to global trade and security. Soviet Union, you don't want to do that, you don't get benefits. We're not at a Bretton Woods moment regarding cyber. What becomes normalized, acceptable behavior is not going to come from our aspirations, but through our behavior and our behavior shaping the behavior of others. So what's the basis for us to behave in this space? Every policy speech, every major CEO on YouTube that talks about cyberspace starts off with the tagline, cyberspace is global and it's interconnected. And then they move on as if that's a throwaway line. But I want to suggest to you that it's in fact the operating principle in this domain. We cannot treat it as a throwaway line. So what does it mean to act in a domain that's truly interconnected? We need to develop a strategy that embraces the reality of that interconnectedness. And I would submit to you that right now, we're sort of locked in to a legacy of success, but a framework that comes from a strategic environment that doesn't map to the strategic environment of cyber. Our current thinking is permeated with a deterrent-centric perspective. The policymaker's default when we get a cyber attack is, where's my cyber button, right? Where's my option to retaliate, to signal, right? What can I hold at risk? But deterrence is showing up in our policy guidance, through our capabilities discussions, all the way through our decision-making structures. But the structural features of cyberspace lead to this following conclusion: that cyber is not a deterrent space. And we need to orient ourselves away from this framework. After 71 years of success, that's a tough thing to do, right? But we've forgotten that deterrence was really an answer to a specific strategic environment. It's not the answer to every security challenge that we face. Bernard Brody and his colleagues, 1946, right, thought this through. And what they understood was that there was this radical change that had to occur in the base question we were asking regarding security. The whole notion of one plane, one bomb, one city. Change that question to, how do I secure when I can't defend? They realized that they were in fact in an offensive dominant environment. The answer they came up with was that we're going to have to change the thinking of our adversary. We're going to have to convince them not to attack us in the first place. What we've tended to forget is that this was a really radical departure, right, from a couple millennia of human military history. The notion that security doesn't rest in your hands, but in the heads of your enemy. We've gotten very comfortable with that, in part because the answer we came up with, deterrence, actually did capture the technological revolution that nuclear weapons, that splitting the atom, brought to the operational space. In fact, what made nukes as effective as a deterrent was not the scale that they produced, but the fact that that scale could be reached incontestably. In fact, it created this crystal ball effect in which decision makers could actually envision the place that they didn't want to wind up, Armageddon. And in fact, the Soviets and the United States mutually agreed that that was an unacceptable outcome. We have to recognize that that is a very particular and peculiar and distinct strategic environment. Everywhere else, in a conventional, kinetic, and even cyber strategic environment, costs are contestable. It's not scale that drives this, right? So Verdun, horrible World War I battle. But no matter how high the casualty rates, 60% in the first offensive, right? That scale was not sufficient to cause pause. What we have to recognize is that ultimately, in the nuclear realm, we got the metaphor right. It was as simple as pressing the button and getting this outcome. That's a very, very distinctive environment that created a different set of decision-making models, a whole new military structural change, STRATCOM, right? Different funding, different training, etc. But again, it introduced some really crazy ideas. I mean, imagine if I had walked into Congress and said, before 1945, during the war, and said, I've got this plan to secure the country. I want you to spend trillions and trillions of dollars building a redundant set of military capability whose purpose will be that you never use it. How quickly would I have been kicked out on the street with that? But we became very comfortable with that notion because we got the strategic environment right. And we understood and captured it in this notion of deterrence. Right? And so everything else that followed, things like escalation management, right? And escalation ladders. Prior to 1945, we called that winning or losing, right? So there was this whole new lexicon that came in to play because of the power of the concept. And so what I want to suggest to you for the rest of this talk is that cyber has its own distinctive environment as well. Just as nuclear was an environment of offense dominance, cyber is a distinctive domain unto itself. It is an interconnected domain of constant contact and the persistence of the offense. It's not a military domain. It's an interconnected domain in which the military has to operate alongside everybody else. If you understand the difference, if you think that through for a second, the difference between a military domain and an interconnected domain in which the military has to operate alongside everyone else, it starts to force us into very different choices about forces, choices about operational art. These three elements, interconnectedness, constant contact, and persistence, is what define a new strategic environment. The implications of these two first variables are really quite intriguing. Right? For example, again, if we play this notion of interconnectedness out, we've tended to always want to compartmentalize conflict, areas of hostilities, combatants, and non-combatants. Right? It's all about segmenting that off into a separate space. Well, again, if this is not a throwaway line, if this is the operational principle, right, upon which we have to build an art form, you don't have the luxury of segmenting it, right? You actually have to figure out a strategy of interconnectedness, right? And that's the challenge that we face. It's not an aberrant condition to have the military operating alongside the business sector, alongside the ally and the enemy. And we're going to have to get used to that. We've got the right metaphor. It's a web, but we're not willing to think through the implications, or we haven't to date really grasped the implications of that web. The technology itself is what's driving this, because it's adaptive and iterative. And this feeds this dynamic of persistence, and this is reinforced by the fact, right, that the space itself is constructed by everything that we're doing, right? So we've got this constantly shifting arena in which to operate. Cyber is a constructed space. Every new software, hardware, and system integration of new uses, plus each update of existing platform, creates new demands for the defense and new opportunities for the offense. There is no steady state of cyber terrain, so there is no steady state of achieved defense. Defense is a dynamic construct relative to the offensive opportunities that emerge with each 2.0 of cyber terrain. The tools and skills used to engage in offense are iterated. They're not fully perishable. It's the particular attack vector or code that could be conceded through discovery and effective defense in the moment. But it's conceded only in that iteration until a new exploit can challenge new undefended terrain. This, of course, is all being done in an interconnected space in which red and blue is operating with business and the regulatory gray space, with citizens, with white and black hackers and allies. The critical combined point here is that the terrain of cyberspace encourages persistence, and the technology itself allows it. This requires us to think through a different form of maneuver, a different form of operational tempo, a different form of command. The offense will persist. The contact with the enemy will be constant. The defense will succeed occasionally, and this is the fundamental difference, right? This is not an offense-dominant environment like the environment of nuclear weapons. We can defend, but you defend in a moment. And as that terrain shifts, there's yet another space to defend. Right? The opportunity costs, because of the technology itself, are so low to operate in this space. This feeds the combination of the space changing. That's why there's always an opportunity to design around, right? And the technology itself encouraging this persistence because the opportunity cost is so low. What I would suggest is that these notions, analytical notions of offense and defense, might actually be too intellectually constraining as well. Because the other thing that's happening in this space of constant contact, if we think about the implications of that, is that, yeah, there's borders in cyberspace. They're porous, right? But everybody lives on everybody else's border simultaneously. Constant contact is not imminent contact. It's not possible contact, right? Constant contact suggests this immediacy, right? And so as we automate, as we go and bring more AI to the table, time is only going to get crushed even further. And so I would suggest to you that the better way to think about what's going on that chessboard, right, is actually a contest, not of offense-defense, right, but of denying, disrupting, seizing, and retaining cyber initiative. Just as Brody realized that he had to reframe the question, we have to reframe the dependent variable here, if you will, use a social science term. We have to think about seizing the cyber initiative in this highly fluid space. If I allow somebody into my network, but then use their maneuver into mine to maneuver them back out to hack back onto the other side, is that defense or offense? No, that's actually a decent wrestling move where I've used their momentum, right, as I grapple with them to then turn and seize the initiative. That's success in this space operationally. So Brody got us to think about a different question in the nuclear environment. We need to think about cyber in a different way, understanding this interconnectedness. And so the question becomes, in an interconnected domain, how do I secure in an offense persistent environment when I'm in constant contact with the adversary, the ally, the business sector, the civilian, domestic and foreign civilian? If we begin to operate from this starting point, that our environment is one of persistence and our security question rests on the challenge of constant contact, then we need to think differently again about concepts like tempo, like key terrain. So when I lose terrain in a traditional environment, my first impulse is to go and regain it. But if this is constructed space, I have to think about maneuver differently. Can I just construct new space that regains the functionality lost, right, from losing that supposed key terrain? If we move from conceptualizations that are tied to geography to ones that are tied to a dynamic constructing terrain that is fully interconnected, right, it opens up new definitions of what it means to maneuver. To date, this sort of deterrent-centric framing has had us focused on a measure of effectiveness that focuses on the absence of action. If I'm deterring successfully, nothing's happening. Right? That doesn't map to this space. It doesn't map to a persistent strategic environment. And so therefore, we have measures of effectiveness that we can never live up to. We're already starting from a failing standpoint. So when senior leadership goes in front of congressional committees and are asked, why are we not deterring X, Y, and Z in cyber? That's actually the wrong question, right? The question that they need to be asked is, how are we doing seizing and retaining, denying and disrupting cyber initiative? Nuclear thinking produced a whole set of new words, escalation management, and new focus, measures, display, demonstration, things of this nature. We're really still very early into this cyber game. We do not have cyber equivalents to this. What I suggest to you is that our job needs to think through the framework first before we start thinking about these definitions, because these are going to map differently in an environment of persistence. We have to realize that persistence is 180 degrees from deterrence. It's the exact opposite. There is no deterrent space if you're in a persistent environment. And therefore, again, when we think about measures of success, you can't avoid conflict or you can't avoid action in an environment of constant action. And that's the environment in which we're in. So when we get to one of my favorite movies, Joshua in War Games, right? Joshua got it right, when understanding nuclear thinking.
Strange game. The only winning move is not to play. How about a nice game of chess?
But what Joshua didn't anticipate was how complex cyber chess was going to be. But that's what we have to start to play. And the good news here is that among all the actors out there in cyberspace, we have an organizational culture in the United States, within our intelligence community and within our military, that maps to persistent better than most everybody else. When you think about our training, when you think about our command structure, we trust the edge. We push things down to the space in which persistence is occurring. So if we, in fact, want to move to a deeper understanding of an operational art of cyber, we have to embrace this interconnectedness, not run away from it, and ultimately master constant contact, as a master of chess may master that game of strategy. The reason we're going to be able to do this effectively is because our tendency is to empower individuals. And in the cyber strategic environment, the individual is a strategic asset. It's their creativity. It's their ability to think about how I can gain that initiative in what's going to be not days, not months, but seconds at times. Right? So we have the organizational space and place and culture to succeed if we actually map ourselves to that strategic frame. We need to flip the decision-making model and stop asking the question, what can we put at risk? Right? And actually look at it from the reverse. What does this action put at risk? And if it's not at the strategic level, then we should get at it. And if we look at the behavior that's going on in this space, many others are engaging in that behavior from that perspective. Developing a strategy of cyber persistence that rests on retaining cyber initiative while in constant contact globally will require us to engage in cyber thinking, just as we did in the nuclear era and in the nuclear space, and picked up on ideas that wouldn't make sense, right, anywhere else. So we're going to discover activity in this space, right, that doesn't make sense unless you understand the power of connecting, no pun intended, an interconnected domain that's driven by constant contact and the dynamic of persistence. The challenge, of course, is that since we began this talk, cyberspace is constructed multiple times. And that means there's new space that needs to be secured. And in fact, that there's someone somewhere out there who's seeking the initiative. We need to seek that initiative and get going on that right away. I hope that gives you something to chew on and something to think about. And thank you today for coming out.